So Newcomb has educated thousands of students who've gone on to lead fantastic and interesting lives. So it's my pleasure to welcome Wes Cusworth into our classroom today to talk about his journey since leaving school and talk to us about being the ghostwriter of Gary Ablett Jr.'s autobiography, which was released last week. So welcome, Wes, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much. Hello to students and also staff. It's an absolute pleasure to have the opportunity to speak with you.
Could you please tell us a little bit about yourself, what you did after Year 12 and what do you do now?
So I completed Year 12 in 1982 at what was then called Newcomb High School, but of course now is Newcomb Secondary College. And I moved off to Ballarat to do university, 4 years of study as a secondary PE teacher and also English teacher. I then taught at Werribee and I taught at Christian College in Geelong. And then I had what I describe as a midlife crisis career change where I did what I felt that I always wanted to do, which was to move into the media and had the opportunity to work in television. And part of that was as a television sports news reader, which was fabulous. So my journalistic experience extended to press, also as in print, radio and television. And then now I've moved back into the education system in a marketing and communications role. But because of my contact with Gary Ablett, I had this opportunity to actually ghostwrite his autobiography, which is a really exciting project.
Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit about your upbringing and your school days here at Newcomb?
Sure. I went to Leopold Primary School and actually travelled in from Leopold on the bus, sometimes the old Port Arlington Road route and sometimes the Queenscliff Road route. Sometimes I rode my bike. Most of the time I was either dropped off in a car or caught the bus. The Newcomb High days, I developed some really fantastic friendships, some of which I still maintain through social media and also in physical form, catching up with people across the course of time. I had some great teachers. I had some really inspiring teachers, and I had some really positive experiences that prepared me for my life after school.
Fantastic. So, moving straight on to your book that you've just released, can you explain what a ghostwriter actually is?
So, a ghostwriter is a role where you actually do basically the bulk of the work for a book. So, Gary Ablett is obviously a highly talented sportsman. He's got lots of entrepreneurial skills and he's got lots of things that he's spending his time doing, but he didn't have a lot of time to actually write a book. What he did have time for, which was for me to interview him and then for me to go away and to put his story, for me to take up that challenge of putting his story down on print, which was essentially, I suppose, trying to capture his thoughts and express those through the form of a book.
And how did you actually get the opportunity to work with Gary on his new book?
So I actually, in my time at teaching at Christian College, I actually taught Gary in Year 10. I taught all 4 Ablett children and also got to know Gary Ablett Sr. for those people that are aware of who he is. Obviously, you're a different generation to me who got to see Gary Ablett Sr. play, but you may have seen some highlights. And I taught Gary Ablett Jr. in Year 10, and that experience led me to obviously having some sort of knowledge of him and him of me. And then in late 2018, in my role as a master of ceremonies at a sports event that he was speaking at, we actually had a really lengthy road trip where we talked extensively at a fairly personal level about his family, a family that's lived their life in the public spotlight. And as a consequence, I think we strengthened our relationship. And then in early 2019, he came to me and asked me if I would actually interview him and then to ghostwrite his book, which was a great experience.
And so, can you describe the process once you kick that off? How that all happened and how you went about collecting your information and putting it all down into print?
Sure. So essentially, I spent a lot of time with Gary interviewing him, sometimes over the phone, but quite often we actually met in person. And I can tell you that Gary Ablett Jr. really likes his coffee. We spent lots of time drinking coffee together. I have my trusty little dictaphone with me here. Now, the dictaphone came in for a lot of use because obviously I was able to record all of the conversations that we have. And it's fantastic to have that actual recording, sound recording of all of those interviews across the course of that time. the opportunity arose to sit with Gary and to record all of the conversation and to try to piece it away around um, a structure where his book would be explained and his life story would be told. So it was a really fabulous experience to get to know him well and to visit him and to have meals with him. And as I said, a lot of coffee.
And how often do you think you would catch up?
So worked in fits and starts, which means that sometimes we would have a couple of meetings within a week and then we'd go for a few weeks without a meeting. But I think overall there would have been 20 to 25 hours spent on actually interviewing Gary to have him tell stories. And then I was in a situation where I basically went through that process and then working in conjunction with the publisher, they basically said, we'd like to know a little bit more about this. So then I went back to Gary with some further questions about certain things and asked if I could find out some more details there.
All in all, how long did it take to write the book?
That's a really tough question to answer because it basically involved a lot of time outside of last year's Christmas holidays, but almost in addition to that, the entirety of those Christmas holidays. So it was a really, really solid time frame. It was stretched out across the course of about 18 months.
Mm. So when you started all of this, how did you go about determining what Gary wanted out of a book and what the publishers might have wanted out of a book as well? Were they the same things? Were they different? How did you go about determining that?
That was one of the key questions because there's certainly things about Gary's personal life that the publishing company would love to have heard more about that Gary wasn't really prepared to say. There's some sensitivities around the Ablett story, around the Ablett family, but most of that is outside of Gary Ablett Jr.'s life. The publishing company probably would have been quite interested in some of that material, but essentially Gary Ablett Jr. made it really clear about the framework in which we were operating. So there was obviously a bit of a merging of two different ideas there. There had to be some sort of concession made by both the publishing company and also Gary in terms of offering information that was worthy of a book and really noteworthy and worth a read so that people actually get hold of it. I mean, it's a fantastic book that's got a lot of photos in it. So it's not just about text, it's about the imagery, and that's a really important part of it too.
Mm. So what questions do you ask and what questions don't you ask?
So your questions about Gary's upbringing, which I think were the sorts of things that people hadn't really heard about. And I think they were really, really important to create a sense of place so that we could actually place Gary to talk to him about what it was like for him when he was in year 7 at school and what sort of aspirations that he had. I think they're the sorts of things because a lot of the things that uh, Gary's life entailed, which were the successful football experiences such as 2 Brownlow medals and 8 All Australians nominations, and all of those sorts of things are generally public knowledge. But what people needed to know to make the book really worth reading was some of the more personal detail that they wouldn't necessarily come across. So they were the sorts of things that we targeted. Some of the things that we steered clear of were the personal things and maybe some of the difficult things. He did address the death of his older sister, Natasha. She sadly died a number of years ago. And so that's always really, really tough for a person to talk about the death of a sibling. And I understand that. Gary did touch on that, but the reality is that there's probably some areas where we just let people have their space and we don't necessarily need to pry into their personal life.
And how do you check that the client is actually happy with what you've been writing?
So Gary has a reputation for being one of the last people, or certainly when he was a footballer, had the reputation for being one of the last people to actually sign his playing contract because he was so fastidious and meticulous about all of the detail within that. And I found the case was much the same with the book. So that what we found was that Gary was very, very interested in making sure that the fine detail was in fact accurate. And so probably even more so about the personal things that I had accurately represented him, as opposed to even maybe some of the football detail that some of which he remembered clearly and other parts he didn't necessarily remember clearly. And I had to research that sort of thing. But the good thing is that his footy record is out there in the public forum and people get to see that. But the bottom line was that Gary and I actually spent quite a bit of time with him reading the manuscript. So I basically, in keying that in and being able to print that out in physical form, I was able to put that in front of him and he was able to look over that.
And what are some of the key skills that you might need to be a ghostwriter?
I think one of the things obviously is that capacity to write. The reality is this experience was all about asking the key question, getting Gary to talk, having him feel comfortable about expressing his thoughts and his views and having a level of openness about his experiences. And then me being able to record that and then put that into a nice orderly fashion. So I think what was really, really important was the opportunity for me to accurately represent the sorts of things that he was saying and to provide a structure that made a bit of sense, which hopefully when you get hold of the book, which I do have a copy of the book here, when you get hold of the book and you have a read and hopefully you find it really informative and really interesting, but also logical in terms of the progress and the structure of his story.
And what are some of the challenges? I think you've touched on that a little bit, the challenges of being a ghostwriter.
I think one of the most significant challenges of being a ghostwriter is accurately expressing and capturing that person's voice, because the reality is I write for the Geelong Advertiser. For those of you that follow cricket, I write on a Monday and also a Friday. I've done lots of writing, but the reality is I write differently to what the way that Gary might write. So one of the biggest challenges was for me to constantly be catching myself to make sure that I was actually representing him accurately and it wasn't just a biography and me writing about him, but it was actually him and his voice. That was a really, really key sort of thing. So when you undertake the responsibility of ghostwriting for anyone, it's really, really important that you sometimes you take your own thoughts and your own words and put them aside and you actually try to capture what that person is actually trying to say.
Yeah. So for that, do you go back to your recordings? How do you accurately capture their voice?
Yeah, I think that's a really important thing to do, is to constantly be just checking yourself against the sorts of recordings that you might have to make sure that you're actually expressing things. And once again, you're organizing their thoughts and you're maybe formalizing things, but the reality is you need to try to capture the way that they might express things.
Yeah. And it's sort of not as simple as just taking down the recordings word for word. Like, do you go through a process of actually regurgitating that out in a different way that it was said?
I think so. I think there's a bit of a combination of, there might at times be really key quotes where things are really well expressed by the subject, such as Gary, and you can record things word for word, but in reality, almost certainly you're going to need to try to capture their voice, but also formalize things a little bit to make things sound a little bit more logical. And also, I think one of the key things about any form of writing is to make sure that you're always looking to use a variety of words. That's why I think you can probably see in the background behind me, I have a rather large collection of books. Now, that's just one of my bookcases. That's actually just the cricket books that I've got. And so I've got other bookcases out of shot, and so I do a lot of reading. I've always got at least a book and sometimes multiple books on the go. And I think one of the great benefits of reading is that it exposes us to language that we might not typically use. We might not hear in the schoolyard, we might not hear at school, and even in the classroom, but it exposes us to language and word use, which is quite diverse. And I think that's a really, really important thing. And when it came to writing Gary Ablett Jr.'s autobiography, I was seeking to truly represent him, but at the same time, make sure that the language that I was using was really interesting.
And what was it like to work with Gary?
Gary is a really fabulous man. I must say that I taught him when he was in year 10. So he was a 15, 16-year-old boy who was focused on the things that really interested him. And I'm not sure that all of the classroom things that we were talking about necessarily interested him at the time. But he was really quite focused on the idea of making a professional sports career. To actually see him many years later as an adult and what a fabulous man he'd become, very warm, very embracing, very engaging, always prepared to give his time, loves a game, loves a joke. He's a really fabulous fellow. And, at different times when we were having coffee or having meals together, we were actually interrupted by people that were coming to get autographs or to have photos taken and things like that. yet he was always prepared to give his time. He didn't actively seek attention or the spotlight. He's a really humble man, but at the same time, he was always happy to give his time.
Is it common for ghostwriters to be hired for something like this?
Yeah, it is quite commonplace, because what we find is that sports athletes might not necessarily have the skills, or they may not necessarily have the time. And I think Gary could have quite comfortably written something himself, but I think he acknowledged the fact that he had other priorities. Obviously, he was still playing. He's got a wife and a young child, and he's been through some fairly difficult circumstances even this year. But I think Gary is the sort of person that acknowledged the fact that his time was really of the essence for him, and he needed to maybe offload some of that responsibility. So it is really commonplace for high-profile sports people to engage someone that they trust, and I think that was the thing that to me was I felt a great privilege and a great compliment, was the fact that he would come to me in the belief that I would convey his story and accurately represent his journey. And I think particularly for Gary, because so much of his life has been about his faith journey as a Christian, and he and I are very much on the same page in that space. And so I think that he saw me as someone that he could trust in that regard.
So these students here are about to do an activity where they're going to be taking on the role of a ghostwriter, and they'll have a chance to win a copy of the autobiography. Do you have any tips for them?
It starts with the questioning. I think you've got to not only give a person an opportunity to say what, when they're sharing their story, to say what they want to say, but you've also got to listen really, really carefully. And whilst you might go into an interview with certain questions in mind, you do need to listen very carefully to the answers that they provide, because that might be a key to some of the other questions that you might like to ask. I think when you're doing this process of acting as a ghostwriter for someone, it's really, really important to make sure that you're accurately representing that person. And once again, not putting things into your words, but listening really carefully to the way that they express things, and to ensure that you're paying true justice to what they might actually be wishing to convey.
Hopefully they'll enjoy the exercise and they've enjoyed your talk, and they might be interested in a career as a journalist, a creative writer, or someone in communications. Do you have any tips for advice for students who are interested in writing?
I think, once again, as I mentioned about reading, I think reading and writing are typically those sorts of things that English teachers speak about going together, and I think that's very true. And obviously, so reading a broad range of material, whether it be magazines or books or newspapers or the like, just to keep things ticking over in terms of understanding different language, and also a variety of sentence structures and all of those sorts of things. And so reading broadly. And when it comes to maybe choosing a vocation such as journalism, then really being quite well rounded in terms of your understanding of the world, and making sure that you're across a lot of different subjects. I think that's really, really quite helpful, and not being too narrow. Even if you wanted to be a sports journalist, I still think you need to understand the bigger picture of what goes on in the world, and also pursue those sort of opportunities. Like, for a long time, I actually was a freelance reporter for various Geelong newspapers, and I started doing that on a voluntary basis many years ago, just because I really was quite passionate about it and quite fascinated by the whole process. And I was prepared to do things for nothing, just to get involved and to show what I could actually do. So I don't think that you've always got to be making money out of things to start that journey heading along that particular pathway, and the doors may well open up for you.
Mm. Any questions from students here? I'll just.
Ollie does down the back
Yeah.
there.
You want to come up?
Come on, Ollie. Come on, pick up to the computer.
Yep.
This one isn't really a question, but I wanted to tell you this. So it was my dad's birthday on Sunday, and we actually bought him the book.
Oh,
Fantastic.
Yeah, and yeah,
That's great news. Thank you so much. I hope he really enjoys it.
yeah, he will.
Thank you. Thanks for that good news.
it's got at least one sale.
Yes. That's the interesting thing, was that I was quite fascinated in the fact that I mean, the book has about 70,000 words, more than 200 pictures, and it's a really, really great story. And I'm not saying it's a great story because I wrote it. I'm saying it's a great story because Gary's a great man and deserves to have a really lovely book in his honor. That's a coffee table type book, nice hardcover. And there was a 40,000 print run. And I can tell you that it's least expensive at Target and Kmart. So that might be a tip for the future.
Good tip. Thank you for your time today. It's great to hear from a proud Newcomb Export. Any final words for our students?
I just want to say that I think that when I was in Year 7 and making my progress through Newcomb High School, and I wasn't particularly focused on any given occupation, but as time unfolded, I wanted to become a PE teacher and also had that massive interest in journalism. And the reality is, I think I would just like to leave with you all a very important message of the fact is whatever it is that you choose to do, whether it's those sorts of fields of work or whether it's becoming a rocket scientist or a doctor or a nurse or whatever you want to do, I just don't let anyone tell you that you can't do a particular occupation. I think you just need to listen really carefully to your teachers, follow their directions, trust their judgment on the way the way that they might guide you through your subject selection and ultimately to the sorts of things that you might do at the top end in Year 12. And as you explore all the different possibilities, just remember that there are many different pathways to achieving the goals that you wish to achieve. Because I didn't become a journalist until I taught for 20 years. So the reality is your life can take different paths, and also at different stages of your life, you can undertake different occupations. So just keep in mind the fact that you can do anything. And I wouldn't have expected that I wound up doing this particular project, but there you go. And I hope that you have a very successful future, whatever you might choose to do.
Thank you.
Thank you.